Welcome, Professor Vito. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can we start with a random question about the listeners about yourself and your interests?
Yeah, well, my major interest is in genetics. Actually, I'm still teaching genetics at the university, and that's what I did for the past 15 years. But then I was saying the idea was to apply genetics for the everyday life. So about 2 years ago, we started up a spin-off from the university, and we are translating now the knowledge we have in genetics for the applications in nutrition and in pharmacology to test the effectiveness of nutrition regimen and pharmaceutical regimen for people.
For people, okay. I have one question about what you are doing in the free time and your hobby. Like, for a warm-up question.
I play in a jazz band.
Wow.
Yeah, that's.
And the weekends,
my wife
or?
is very disappointed about this because I spend all the Saturday playing jazz guitar. Yeah.
It's very interesting, but you told me that you play volleyball?
Well, that was when I was
younger?
16, 17 years old.
And right now it's music.
Now it's music, which is much more relaxing.
Maybe it will prolong your life. Okay, next question would be about the field of immunology. You started in the field.
Yeah, I started in immunology. Actually, I did my postdoc at the National Institute of Health in the United States and the Laboratory of Cellular and Molecular Immunology. At that time was the beginning of a genetic engineering, the genetic manipulation of mice. It was a very challenging period, and if I have to define myself, I feel like a molecular biologist rather than a geneticist. And then I applied the techniques of molecular biology to the understanding of our genetic response, our immune response, which I think is one of the most fascinating field
The connection
in science. Because if you think about the concept of self, we have our brain. Usually we consider our nervous system as responsible for the concept of say, and myself. I am I because my nervous cells tell that that's me and that's different than you, and I am an organism, you are another organism. But the same thing is done by the immune system. Our immune system recognizes myself, and you know that during transplantations, for example, they are not allowed because the immune system of the recipient, they recognize that there is something which is different. And this concept of what is the self and what is the non-self, and how we establish this, it's I think one of the most fascinating things.
What's more important, immune system or nervous system?
Yeah.
What's the first? Like, have a response.
Actually, if you there are some very simple organisms like coelenterates. Coelenterates, they are sponges. Okay, so if you take a sponge from the Pacific Ocean, you can disgregate it in the component cells, but you leave them in water, and the day after you go there, and the sponge is reformed again. And if you take a sponge from the Atlantic, it will be the same. You can disgregate it in the component cells. You leave there for one night, and the day after you go, and you will see again the sponge. But if you take a sponge from the Atlantic Ocean and then from the Pacific Ocean, you disgregate in the component cells, you mix them, what will happen? Do they will mix? No, they do not. You will see. So that means before the nervous cells, because of course they have no nervous cells, there is something in their cells that can make those cells able to recognize that they belong to the same organism. This is also fascinating when we switch from the protozoans to metazoans. So from organisms which are made by a single cell to organisms which are made by more than one cell. And we are metazoan, so we are made by many cells, but those cells, they know that they belong to the same organism. So the individual is not the cell, but it's the complex of cells.
Okay. But you think like for people who want to individualize the lifestyle, diet, or many things, that the immune system and the nervous system and the component genetic is must to have to individualize the stuff, like.
Yeah, of course. If we think about, those things, nutrition is important, but we have always to think about that we are coming from an evolution which started 7 million years ago, and during these 7 million years, our genetic background was selected on what we were able to eat in the past 7 million years. We cannot, switch completely in one day from another our diet, and we think that our genetics, which was selected for so long time, can adapt immediately to the new diet regimen. The one thing that I think it's makes me really sometimes upset is this fashion now about natural products, with the concept that what is coming from nature is good, whereas what is coming from chemistry is bad. I think this is a completely wrong concept, because nature has not evolved to satisfy the humans' well-being.
Well-being, okay. Give us some examples.
Yeah, because if you think about the most powerful poisons we know today, they are natural products. And that's because nature doesn't care about humans and doesn't care about all the other living species. Nature follows some pathways that do not coincide with the human evolution.
Okay. So you think that we must to select the food and the chemistry to work for ourselves, not only taking that this only natural and will help us. Like we must to have wide range of.
I think diversity in food it's important. I also don't like the concept of proteins are good, fats are unhealthy, sugars are bad or are good. I think that human populations have been selected on what they could eat. I'm from Italy, and in Italy it's very common, the Mediterranean diet, and we are so proud that Mediterranean diet is so good. So it looks like we were more intelligent than other populations. But the Mediterranean diet is good for the Mediterranean populations because they have been selected on that diet. So therefore, those populations, either they were able to metabolize those those kind of food and adapt to them, or they were selected against. They would die.
How long do you think the adaptation is?
That I think takes thousands of years.
Thousands.
Yeah.
So okay, when a guy from Alaska go to Italy, it will take thousands of years to adapt to this diet.
Maybe less, because now the humanity is so mixed. So you might find some Italian genes in the Alaskan populations.
We have genes like
as well. But of course, our genes have evolved on the diet we were fed on.
Okay. So if we want to really go deep into nutrition, we want to know our genomes, and then start to like.
Well, we can start from a very simple concept on how genetics affects our diet. There are some people which can drink milk until the last days of their age and are pretty good, whereas there are some others which cannot at all.
Yeah,
Actually,
yeah, we feel it.
and this also it's a nice concept. So because the food is the same. So is milk good or is something which makes you feel sick?
Yeah.
And also, the same applies with coffee. For example, there are some people that they drink coffee just before going to sleep, whereas if some other they do the same, they will
Because
have
fast metabolism,
a drama. So that means that the individuals they have an approach to the same food components, which is completely different. For some people, lactose is good. For some people, is not. And actually, regarding this milk lactose tolerance, let's say abnormal, the mutants are people that can
Tolerate. Yeah.
can tolerate.
I don't know
lactose.
how is big the population who can tolerate the
Yeah,
milk,
now
but
it's quite big. It's quite big because, of course, evolutionary it was an advantage.
Yeah.
Because in the Karisti periods, if you were able to drink milk, that would have been an advantage. So we have two different mutations.
mutations.
Yeah, one in.
You think like the testing is good to personalize this diet?
I think in 10 years, every single human will be genetically defined.
Defined.
Because even now the cost for genetic
going
analysis is going. I mean, if you think about when we did the genome project that was at the beginning
Yeah.
the 21st century, it costed millions of dollars. Now, if you want to do the same, it will cost a few $1,000s. And because technology is growing so fast that in 10 years, every newborn will have his genome
And we will
defined.
know, yeah.
And we will know from the beginning.
But we can like mass think like the tolerance of protein, fat, and everything. Like we can go deeper in the gene, you know.
Yes, because we can apply the same concept. Now we have some basic knowledge. We know why you are lactose intolerant, and you know why you can drink caffeine. Because in one case, you have the lactase that is expressed in the other case, for the metabolism of caffeine, we know that there are cytochromes. And of course, with major knowledge, we will know what is the impact of any food component on our enzymatic background. So
And we can predict the, you know, like nutrition sensitivity or autoimmune disease.
absolutely,
Yeah, it's-
absolutely. That's
so
the same
my
way of
daughter,
starting with.
I would do the testing on her, and I know like she will have a predisposition to certain disease, and I can, you know, take this approach to not develop the disease.
Right. Well, that's still because there are some genetic disorders where if you have a mutation, then it's quite likely that you will develop certain kind of disorders.
No matter what
if
you
you
do.
think about the story of Angelina Jolie.
Yeah, famous.
Okay, yeah. So we know because if you have mutations in the BRCA genes, that is quite likely that you will develop breast cancer. So then she took that decision that was quite drastic.
That you will not do anything. Tell our listeners.
But even if you don't do surgery to your breast, but at least you know, so you can go more often for examination, for example.
Yeah.
And this type of test is somehow useful because at least it makes an alert in your mind.
Brain that you can.
There are some others I am not. I disagree with. For example, there are tests that are that measure your predisposition to develop Alzheimer.
Yeah, I saw
Okay.
these tests.
Okay, so Alzheimer is one of the most horrible diseases we have now because there is no cure for it. So now, what is the advantage if I tell you your risk of developing Alzheimer, especially if it's high? There is nothing you can do about because there is no cure. So that information is not useful to you, is not useful to your doctor because
Okay.
it's only useful for an insurance company, for example.
Okay, but
which-
I want to have this information because maybe someday, you know, 10 years we'll know some answers. Like some people do not. I think it's very hard to have some information that are not good for you. Like
I think there is no usefulness in genetic information where there is nothing you can do about
You
it.
can, okay. Right now, Alzheimer's disease is we
Yeah.
can know about it. Okay, fascinating.
And fortunately, in fact, this information is covered by privacy, so it cannot be disclosed.
Okay. But like celiac disease or antioxidant
Yeah,
capacity
for example,
is very
there are
good.
many other genetic tests which are very useful. For example, to know that you are carrier of the haplotype for celiac disease.
Disease, yes.
Yeah, it might tell you that you should avoid some kind of food.
There is testing that you think they are good for people who are engaging in exercise or sport, like the genetic testing. Like
Yeah, on the sport there are some tests now for that can predict your sport performance. For example, if you are if your muscle fibers are for fasting
Swiss
or yeah,
slow
yeah.
twist and fast twist.
Yeah, there
endurance.
are also some tests that can predict your capacity to recover from injuries. for
Injuries,
example.
And-
And also, for example, that is something we are doing now for some young professional teams. For example, we have the juvenile teams for very big club where they have 100 of young players that they are at the beginning of their career, they are 12, 13, 14, and we check for genetic heart disorders like cardiac hypertrophy.
And you can predict that the young guys can
Yeah,
it.
because some of these are due to genetic mutations,
mutations. Okay.
and so you can at least make some.
Okay, we can switch to sport because you are a consultant for anti-doping agency and tell us about this one because it's a very hot topic and I think
Yeah, actually the reason that is related to my immunology interest because the idea I was interested in doping substances is because that although if you look at the WADA list of substances that are prohibited, there are thousands of them. But we have the test to check for this substance. It's restricted to very few of them. This is because we do not have the technical capacity to detect all the forbidden substances. So my idea was to develop some assay for detection of doping substances based on some natural single-chain antibodies. There are camels which make antibodies which are completely different than
different tests, different
completely,
not
completely
measuring the substance or the substrates, but antibodies to.
Yeah, antibody which recognize that substance.
Oh wow! Yeah. And it's right now in the field.
Yeah, there are. Yeah, it's already. Yeah.
And it's
like
now
if you
applicable.
think about.
So I take a doping one day
erythropoietin.
and I catch it, but the antibodies will be still there because
you can develop antibody which can recognize doping substances.
Okay.
Because those are made recombinantly.
How long the time from taking the substance and making the
Yeah,
test?
some of them they have a very fast metabolism, like EPO.
EPO, yeah.
EPO, you can detect it only a few hours after the injection. And that is the assay that is based on antibodies, because you have an antibody that recognizes injected EPO. Some other they stay longer in the bodies, so you have more chance. Growth hormone or metabolite or.
Where is going the field? What the sports guys are doing? There are no drugs.
I remember when I started this activity, I was very shocked by looking at the list of supplements and enhancers or all these things that professional athletes are taking. And if you think about since professional athletes, when they are in the anti-doping control, they have to declare the list of things they are taking. I was really shocked by looking at the things that the
That's
biker was taking. But then, if you think about the energy requirement for a professional athlete, it's not at all comparable
To a normal person.
yeah.
Or to a normal person who is exercising half an hour after.
After a day. I mean, for example, nowadays, many of the professional athletes, for example, they are suffering by teeth, problem with teeth, and that's because the training they do is so demanding from the energetic point of view that the only way to recover is by drinking these drinks with the high sugar. So and this with this high amount of sugar, it promotes problems.
And I think like the cost of energy are high, and and some sports there, the nervous system is in the battle, and you must be recruiting for calcium and magnesium, and you're taking from the teeth, like for everywhere.
And that's why I think professional athletes they are a different chapter than normal.
But you think like for a guy who do not want to take any substance, doping, then he can, with the diet and the best supplements, do something good to catch this guy who is taking the doping?
I don't know. I really don't know.
Because the doping is a good disadvantages. It's not.
Also, it's sometimes not clear to define what is doping, because as I said, if you take a Protect supplement, you take it maybe every day, but what happens if you take it 10 times a day? Does it give you, because we define doping anything that is enhancing your sport performance. So if you eat meat compared to another athlete that is vegetarian, is your meat that will enhance your sport performance? Because is that considered? Is it doping?
Mm-hmm. So the definition is not good right now, and you think it's...
well, the definition now is that it is doping whatever is enhancing your
performance.
Sport. So if you practice more than me, is that?
Yeah, I understand. It's very complicated here. Okay, I want to switch the chapter about implementation, because I know it's interesting field for you, and the role of low-grade implementation in the disease process.
Actually, inflammation. Inflammation. It's one of the first signs that we see at the starting of any metabolic problem. We did a study in the Middle East looking at because their diabetes, it's a major problem. Like 30-40% of the all population, they suffer from diabetes. And so we analyzed the cohort of 200 people, and which are healthy, so they have no disease at all. And since you know that the incidence of diabetes it's around 30-40%, you know already that if you observe 200 people, you know that 60 of them they are going to get the disease. And in fact, we followed them for about 1 year, and they were in the 20s. You can see that there was a cohort of them which was separating by the other one. And although they do not have diabetes, they start to have inflammatory markers much higher than the comparator.
CRP, high sensitivity therapy, is a good marker to do.
Right, but also
what do you think? Like, what's the marker for me to check? Like, from
I
1 to
would
3.
check. I think the best marker for looking for diabetes or for metabolic disorder, it's insulin.
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 I
yeah.
take it for
Because,
every my
because
client.
we don't do
Like,
we check for diabetes, we look at the glucose, but glucose is just the end point of diabetes.
I'm checking the insulin sensitivity, like free glucose,
Right.
insulin, the Homo ER index calculator, and I see the intrusion
On the
sensitivity.
OMA, yeah,
Yeah,
on
but
the OMA. But still we should look at the insulin after meal.
after a meal, yeah, it's more advanced like test. And you think,
Because the problem is in the curve. You
okay,
know.
but the glucose test or something?
Well, glucose test is very useful to monitor your glucose, but this is at the end of the process. You monitor your glucose when you have already some
Okay.
problems with the glucose metabolism.
What the rate you want to have the insulin in the morning fasting test?
I would do. I think it's more important to have it after meal.
The response of
Yeah,
the
to
insulin.
look at the response of the
Okay.
insulin. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. It's very interesting. What do you think about the markers of chronic inflammation low grade? We can detect it some way?
Well, you can do it through the lipidomic test, for example, which is one of the topic I spoke today about.
Lipidomic test,
The measure in the looking at the fatty acids
fatty
ratio
acids, omega-6 and omega...
between arachidonic acid
acid,
and omega-3 fatty acids. I think this is it's easy, it's fast, and it's
And you
useful to see.
think that the target of 8 of the test from the omega index is a good sign that you have checked this inflammation in your body?
I think it's one of the most useful.
Yes.
Unless you have overt inflammatory markers like interleukins, and the reactive protein.
Okay, the metabolism from...
Yeah, when it's already clinically there. If you want to look at the signs of inflammation in a healthy individual, looking at the fatty acids balance, I think is one of.
What do you think is the best, like 8, 9, 10, 11? Because I know that in Korea they have 13.
Well,
There's one woman in the USA 22, and there are some studies about cognitive performance, and they have like 11 and half was the optimum. But I don't know what you
I think 9, 10 maybe.
9, 10. Okay, yeah. This is a good. But you must eat a lot of fish, white fish, and
yeah, that's
and
another problem
supplementing.
because originally the story came from this Okinawa island where the diet of these people was based on fish.
Yeah, white fish. Right?
But now most of the fish that you eat at the restaurants where it's a raised fish, and sometimes this fish is raised with a very low quality food. So I don't know how much omega-3 is going to be in that fish.
And the supplements.
So in that case, supplements may be useful.
Okay, but I have like 6.5 omega tests, and you think like taking 2 grams of EPH, DHA will be...
Yeah, this is also related to the genetic background, because a little amount of omega-3 is synthesized by our cells, and this is due to the activity of fatty acid desaturase, which are 2 enzymes. And also, to make the story more complicated, those genes have some SNP. So people, they express these enzymes at different level. Some people can make more omega-3 than others. And so therefore the amount of omega-3 that you take with your supplements should be adequate to your genotype, to do your FADS activity.
Okay. But when we cannot convert efficiently the omega-3, at the same time we cannot convert the omega-6 because they're the same enzymes.
But still we see different ratio.
Okay, but my answer is like, if arachidonic acid and omega-6 the end is bad for us, or we can artificially take only omega-3s, and we have omega-6, and I wonder what sometimes we can have the deficient omega-6 It's possible.
Yeah, it's important the ratio
The ratio.
because omega 6 is the precursors of prostaglandins, which are
Yeah.
one of the most inflammatory molecules.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep control.
Control. Okay. So balance between the two.
Balance between the two. Yeah.
DHA and EPA to
Yeah, but
anti-inflammatory.
there are a lot of because also omega-3, you know, there is all this story between EPA and DHA,
The,
which one
conversion.
how should be the ratio, but that's really individual, and also it's related to the age because apparently we need more of one, more in the infancy and the elderly, and the other one, and in the organs. The
Yeah.
requirement might be different.
Different, yeah. The
requirement
brain
for
has
brain,
more arachidonic acid and
yeah,
DHA
and liver. I think we are just at the beginning
of understanding.
of understanding.
Yeah.
this.
I think the arachidonic acid is like, it's not evil. Like you have a lot of omega
of course,
3s
yeah.
and you have a lot of omega 6, but the end arachidonic acid, and this is, I think, is good for the body. I feel in infants and the older studies that
Yeah.
have better cognitive performance
Right,
that have in
right.
the two.
Yeah.
And I don't like, like a generalization, like this is the evil.
I also dislike this kind of approach. You know, this is good, this is bad. I mean, it's kind of somehow like in the diet. You know, the Mediterranean diet is good and everything else is wrong, or the zone diet is good and everything else is wrong. Now, one lady today was telling me about this diet based on the blood type. You
Yeah,
know, if-
yeah, I know.
you
It's
are
very
saying,
popular in the 90s.
I don't know what the scientific rationale for
It's
this,
very-
and still you can take the best diet, the more healthy. I still have not seen any human individual living 150 years.
What's the capacity to live? Like you think like you can live?
I don't know. I think that's another thing because since if you think about evolution, I mean, now we live much longer than 2,000 years ago, but still, since we used to live shorter, we have now selected for genes that may be expressed in the late in our life that we
Or
don't
the
know,
next generation? Yeah,
that
like
we don't know what is the effect of these genes.
genes. Okay.
Simply because we were not supposed to live that longer. Yeah, which is kind of an exception. I mean, if you think about the because nature, it's strange. I mean, you are useful for evolution only if you are able to reproduce.
Yeah, it's like
So, but
it's very short.
which is a very short period. Yeah. So we live all this longer post-reproductive period, which is useless for evolution.
Okay, but people want to live longer, and you think like with
There is also
modification of diet or the drugs, we can go. Like, not naturally, yeah.
Yeah. Actually, if you think about, there are some species, there are some rodents, which are the mule naked, which is kind of it's a rat. They live compared to now. There is a relationship between the body weight and the period of life. Those live much longer. It's like humans, they live 200, 300 years. And they get no cancer, for example, whereas we are very prone to cancer. If you do autopsy on people that die at 90, virtually all of them, they have cancer. All of them. Very small, because at that age, the cancer grows very, very
Slow,
very slow. But all the autopsy of people over 90 years old, they show cancer.
Okay.
So therefore, that means that there is something that happened in our genes that they have not been selected yet. We have not gone in selection to live 200 years, but that will happen. I mean, in a couple of thousand years.
Yes, we have to like, we
We're
have to
now gonna
like,
see it.
We're gonna see. Okay, so you think going back to the markers of chronic inflammation, the omega test is the lipidomic test is very good.
This,
and we
this
can
might be
alter.
good, yeah.
Yes,
This might be.
when I see the test, I think that you told me you don't like the concept of a vegetarian diet because
I
humans not evolve on this
Yeah.
stuff. And when I see the test, like a lot of people, it's you know it's animal omegas, not found in the plant stuff. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm not really against the vegetarian people. I think what I dislike is to be very dogmatic.
Okay, dogmatic.
About a thing. As I said, I mean, the human species has evolved on a protein-rich diet. I mean, we could not evolve actually if we did not accept meat in our diet. I mean, when we evolved since 7 million years now, the one of the success of human evolution was based on the consumption of proteins, which of course was coming from meat.
Yeah.
So when we switched from to a carnivorous diet, we were able to evolve our brain, which is so special compared to all the other primates.
Okay, so because we want to have condensed stuff of nutrients and
Yeah, because it's a machine that requires so much energy, which there is no vegetarian diet that can supply all this kind of energy.
But and the genes was tell you something about what you have predispositions to this kind. More
The genes can tell you if we have a predisposition to disease, to genetic disease. Now we can predict if you can metabolize certain drugs or not. You can predict if certain drugs are going to work or not if you want to cure something. And we can predict if certain food components are going to be metabolized by your body or not. Now, on food, maybe our knowledge is a bit more superficial that we have on drugs, because of course the interest in medical science is much more important than, or at least the efforts that are made in medicine are more important. But I think that with time we will
evolve.
know. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I'm thinking 10 years, 20 years, 30 years.
Yeah, I think, as I told you, in 10 years,
10 years.
every human being will have his genome completely sequenced.
Okay. Going back to the tests, what test do you think is good to monitor to your health status, like for average person?
I think
One was
food
the
intolerance.
Food intolerance.
Food intolerance might be good, and also pharmacogenetics, because the fact that there are, if you look, one of the most known thing in pharmacology is that you have a drug which is used for some disorders, and you have that 70% of people are responding, although with the Gaussian. So some people respond better than others, and 30% of people, they do not respond, and we consider this as normal. You do a therapy, 70% they are responders and say, oh, this is good therapy. 70% will recover from the sickness. So why the other 30% of people, they do not respond? Why? Why is that? And we know now, we are starting to discover that it's because the drugs have a different impact on different genomes. Yeah. So and also, if you think about the dose, we have an antibiotic. You open the box and say take 2 every day, and that's the same for everybody. With the same 1 milligram or 0.5 milligram, and that's the reason why some people get benefit from that drug and
I think the supplements, good supplements, are the same. Like take every day,
and that's the same.
4 times, like
right. That's exactly the same. because it's something that our genome is faced to, and so the outcome will be different according to how different our genes.
But what do you think the food intolerance is a good testings for?
Because some food intolerance might be very dangerous if you consider the gluten intolerance, for example. I mean, people get very sick.
Yeah.
Very,
But you think the field is evolving, or we have one test right now that's or a
we
marker? on
don't have yet.
antibodies?
Yeah, it's still too much expensive to do the full genome for every individual.
Yeah.
But still, it's much less expensive than 20 years ago. So I think that's why I think my prevision is that in 10 years it will be done routinely. So for every newborn, we will know which food can be that individual can assume, which food should be avoided, which drugs. I mean, then the difference, if you think about the difference between the food and drug, it's very subtle.
Yeah.
Because when is that you call this substance a drug and when is it food? Especially if you think about supplements. I mean, omega-3, are they? It's a food or it's a drug?
From a chemistry point of view, it's like
For our genes, there's no difference.
okay, the seed, the substance, and they're like in some ways, like it's no matter from what it's from. But okay, but tell me, you think in the future we can like predict like casein intolerance in milk, like not only a lactose intolerance, but you know,
Absolutely.
lectin intolerance.
I mean, there are lactose intolerant. It's easy because it's only one SNP. So it's one region in our genome where you can. It's one thing, but there might be some intolerance which are much more complex than you know, like
lectin intolerance.
Like
I think this one SNP that will be this one, but I think it's like speculation right now. Like
no, but there might be intolerance which are much more complex. For example, if you look at some disorders with like diabetes, we know that there is a genetic background because we see familiarity in transmission of diabetes, but we don't know which is the gene that causes diabetes because there are many players which are involved, and the same might be for food metabolism. You know, there might be different genes, each one contribute for a little bit.
It's fascinating, like we know, not guess, and because right now is like a lot of work with the elimination diet and all this stuff, and it's fascinating. Once more, when you are testing the inflammatory components of the skin disease, and tell us about this
is another, because my laboratory at the university is interested in signal transduction, looking at the inflammatory pathways. Especially we study the activation of a transcription factor, which is called NF-kappa B, which is responsible for the transcription of many inflammatory genes, and so we were studying some proteins which are involved in the activation in the activation of NF-kappa B. One of these proteins is called KARMA2, and at a certain point, another group discovered that this protein, the gene that encodes for this protein, is mutated in families where they have familiar psoriasis. And so then we developed this interest in skin inflammation, where we look at how NF-kappa B is controlling the progression, the onset and progression of psoriasis in these people.
But in the future, it will be drugs to counteract the pathway, or we can do it like supplements or food or lifestyle.
I'm not well. Psoriasis, it's a very fascinating. Well, maybe fascinating is not the right word for people which suffer of it.
But for science,
it's a human-specific disorder. You know, one way. That is one of the reasons we know so little about psoriasis, because you can study cancer in mice, they have the same disease, or you can study any other disorder. Usually, human disorders can be reproduced in other animal models where you can study. But for psoriasis, it's still an obscure disorder because there is no other species that suffer
I
psoriasis.
don't know.
So it's a human-specific disorder. So that means some humanity and some psychology. Oh, we know for sure because the stress, for example, is one of the factors that might.
And the stress is like impacting the oral tolerance and
also inflammation.
inflammation, and the cascade is going
and which is now because now
controlling the nervous
the
system?
severe psoriasis is cured by steroids, which are immunosuppressive. So
Immunosuppressants,
so therefore you try to block inflammatory pathways.
Okay. But the next time if you are blocking the inflammatory pathways, you're making the immune system weaker.
Oh yeah.
And they can develop another disease or food intolerance. I have a client and the
because
immunosuppressants are very weak.
Right.
Like, I am wondering, is this
that is a very aggressive therapy. I mean, when you are on the steroids.
You don't think like, because in the functional medicine where they are taking like probiotics to enhance the immune system?
Yeah, now there is a big interest on the microbiome, for example, our diet. I have no problem in accepting that the diet will influence the microbiome, because at the end microbiome it's a collection of species that adapt to a certain kind of food components. So therefore, of course, if you change your diet, your microbiome is gonna change completely. But the interesting thing is that it's microbiome itself that is responsible for your health status. This is quite fascinating.
And you think from this disease you can alter the microbiota with the lifestyle, probiotics, good stuff, and
probiotics.
And the disease will not, be so much manifest.
That is what some recent papers are showing. Yeah.
Okay.
We have this transplantation of feci from which is done. Most of those experiments are done in mice, where you can do transplantation of feci. So you do transplantation of microbiome, and you can see that some microbiome is directly responsible for metabolic disorders.
Okay, so we see the metabolic pathway, and we can think we will go into with drugs or supplements or diet, and
I think it will be an holistic approach.
Yeah, I appreciate the science because you're not guessing. You see the pathway, you see the molecules, what you can do about it, and take it for your patients and clients. And for me, it's very fascinating. I think we can end up. It's a topic what you want to speak about.
That I'm very happy to be here. I have a collaboration with some people here since several years now, and I'm very happy that there is so much interest here in Poland about these topics. Really, it was a surprise to me.
Like in Poland, we have a lot of people who want to know more, like not only what we are taught in school.
Yeah, and also the level of knowledge is quite high. I think it's even higher than Italy. But that is something that really has impressed me. The interest.
The interest in the field,
The interest in these topics like nutrition, well-being, longevity, cosmetics.
Okay, I will have the end questions. You told me that you don't take any supplements, and but your colleagues, like professors, do not take any supplements. But
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
I think it's a generational. My generation, we were grown up without taking anything.
Okay.
But my daughter, for example, which is 22,
she's taking.
She's taking supplements.
What kind of supplement?
She takes vitamin D
Candy, okay.
and also some protein.
Okay, but
I
you
don't-
tell me like you are eating the diet of your young age, like
I'm eating the same diet I was eating when I was 5 years old, and that's also nice because at that age you define what you don't like and what you dislike. For example, at that age I disliked cabbage,
yeah,
and I still don't like it. It's strange. Although I tried several times,
that you eat vegetables like
vegetable, yeah, poultry, meat, fish.
meat, fish.
It's quite a variety. Yeah.
But and how your day look like in the schedule of eating and
I eat only in the evening.
one meal?
One meal.
One
yeah.
meal. Okay,
A lot
because
of
you told me
coffee.
that you think the concept of fasting is
I think the concept of
important
fasting,
and
I mean,
not
because the
eating-
dogma now is eat little amount, but very often during the
like
day.
5 times a day.
But we did a study on the Ramadan period, and we saw that those people that have prolonged fast, they have a better parameters compared to the period when they are not fasting.
It's like 16 hours of not eating and
Yeah.
4 hours of eating. Okay.
So usually you have your last meal at 4 in the morning, and then the next one will be at 6 p.m. So it's like 14, 15 hour fasting.
Fasting, okay.
And then the nice thing is that there is no calorie restriction. They eat the same amount of food during the day.
And the insulin
But-
curve, like you told
And the
me,
insulin curve looks much better.
and inflammatory markers are lower.
They go down, diabetes go down, everything is better. And it's nice if you think about that, all the major religions, they all have these fasting periods. We as a Christian, we have the Friday, no meat in the Friday, and also fasting on the Friday. Muslims, they have the Ramadan.
So you think the fasting making diet with the little meals
Yeah.
it's not for everybody.
If you consider about evolution now, I think we should always keep in mind evolution. Can you think about 5 million years ago, you or our progenitors were eating when food was
Available, yeah, like
And
hunting
that
and-
was not a small amount and often.
Sometimes they don't eat
Because
for 2
either
days
right,
because no
Yeah.
food was around.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. So you wake up in the morning, have an espresso.
Coffee,
Coffee, espresso. Espresso, yeah.
espresso.
What kind? Lavazza or what? Do you...
No, I have lavazza.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
And-
lavazza, and then the meal will be at 7 p.m.
1 meal.
Yeah.
Okay. And the days, everything the same? The weekends are the same, or like?
No, on the weekend I have also a slight lunch with the family.
Okay. So in the weekends, 2 meals and
Yeah,
1 meal.
and yeah.
Okay.
Because
a lot
well,
of-
if I'm hungry, I will have something.
Okay.
But I don't
But it help you with the work, like you not have any
because
food.
I fell asleep. If I eat something, even a small sandwich, and I'm not able to work, for example, I don't feel well.
You think the ketone bodies are doing the fuel for the brain and you can work?
Yeah.
Something
But
like-
I don't feel like eating.
Okay. And some days I have the same. Like I can't. The food will slow me down mentally, physically, and I can work.
And also, I don't feel the need. I'm not hungry, so I will rather have a coffee or a tea.
Maybe your ancestors live like this way for.
That's more likely. I
Likely.
mean, they were looking for food for days and days.
You don't take supplements, but for a person who want to take supplements for some reason, like for the lipidomic test, what do you think are the more viable stuff that you can take? Or for a sportsman to attain performance?
Well, at the beginning, when all these thing on the supplements, I was very skeptical about supplements because my question was, why are you taking the vitamin C as a supplement? Why don't you eat an orange instead? Whereas now a bit changed my opinion. It's because sometimes you have no possibility to eat an orange. So, for example, let's say you have a very stressed work day So your only chance to eat if you are hungry is to go to McDonald's.
Yeah.
So then take a vitamin C supplement.
Okay. For the quality of
for the
food.
quality, or take some proteins. Which,
Okay. So think
might be-
what you're missing from the diet, and trying to,
Yeah.
to supplement
So-
in the best way.
because sometimes we don't have the possibility of eat a balanced diet.
Diet.
So we need to balance it with the supplement.
Okay. What will be the one food or supplement or help you will take from, to Mars or a desert island?
Apple.
Apple. Okay.
Yeah.
One,
I would-
you like apples?
I love it.
In Poland we have very good apples.
I know.
A supplement? What's kind of
No, I don't.
You don't know.
Caffeine.
Coffee, yeah, good coffee. That is,
Caffeine. Yeah.
yeah. I wonder what you have your genome from coffee metabolism.
I am a very slow metabolizer.
Very slow metabolism.
Yeah.
So you can drink like
I can. If I have a coffee after 5-6 p.m., I'm not gonna sleep.
you're gonna sleep.
Yeah.
So you drink to this hour, and after this you
Yeah,
can
caffeine and nicotine, I think those are two supplements. Actually, those are protected, because there is this study that smokers, they are protected for Alzheimer.
I see.
You know that study?
No, I know some stuff that smokers have like positive change. Some smokers have
That's the
positive
only positive.
microbiome.
That's the only positive effect of smoking.
Wait, tell me what about this.
It's because Alzheimer. It's a very strange disease, because, for example, people that are which have a high education are protected compared to people with low education, or people that live in cities, they are protected compared to people that live in the countryside. So it's like the way your brain works. I mean, if you are
Stimulating your brain all the
if
time.
you stimulate all the brain, like you are reading the newspaper instead of doing nothing or watching television,
Yeah.
somehow it's protective. And that's why if you live in the urban, if you live in the city, the theater and movies
Are stimulating.
and yeah. So that's why smokers, because the neurostimulants effect of
Is this
nicotine.
nicotine?
Yeah.
Okay, but I can take only
So
nicotine.
if they don't
like-
die before by lung cancer, so yeah, statistically they are more.
But I can take only the nicotine with the cigarette and.
Oh,
and
yeah,
the
yeah.
stuff? It is like gums, like nicotine.
Yeah, there are gums,
They're
yeah.
very stimulating for the cholinergic
Those
pathway.
those are
yeah.
because nicotine is a neurostimulant.
Neurostimulant. Okay. How to lead and live to reach the longest way? We were talking about this. And
I don't know.
a lot of people want to know how to
I
live
think we have
thousands.
to accept the fact that we are gonna die
Okay.
someday.
Listen to good music and live your
Yeah,
life.
playing jazz.
Okay. And the last question will be, if you have a global impact on the world, like on the politics, and you were asking for advice for a law, what do you suggestion to introduce the law to have a healthy population? Like,
I think there is so much disequality in the world, which there is something to do about it.
any advice for our listeners? For life, health,
Enjoy your life.
Enjoy your life. Thank you for your
you're
interview.
welcome.
Have a nice evening and see you soon. I think.
See you.